You comfortable? The Ways of Ghosts by Ambrose Bierce. Present at a hanging. An old man named Daniel Baker, living near Lebanon, Iowa, was suspected by his neighbors of having murdered a peddler who had obtained permission to pass the night at his house. This was in 1853, when peddling was more common in the western country than it is now, and was attended with considerable danger. The peddler, with his pack, traversed the country by all manner of lonely roads, and was compelled to rely upon the country people for hospitality. This brought him into relation with queer characters, some of whom were not altogether scrupulous in their methods of making a living, murder being an acceptable means to that end. It occasionally occurred that a peddler with diminished pack and swollen purse would be traced to the lonely dwelling of some rough character, and never could be traced beyond. This was so in the case of Old Man Baker, as he was always called. Such names are given in the western settlements only to elderly persons who are not esteemed. To the general disrepute of social unworth is affixed the special reproach of age. A peddler came to his house, and none went away. That is all anybody knew. 7 years later, the Reverend Mr. Cummings, a Baptist minister well known in that part of the country, was driving by Baker's farm one night. It was not very dark. There was a bit of moon somewhere above the light veil of mist that lay along the earth. Mr. Cummings, who was at all times a cheerful person, was whistling a tune, which he could occasionally interrupt to speak a word of friendly encouragement to his horse. As he came to a little bridge across a dry ravine, he saw the figure of a man standing upon it, clearly outlined against the gray background of a misty forest. The man had something strapped on his back and carried a heavy stick, obviously an itinerant peddler. His attitude had in it a suggestion of abstraction, like that of a sleepwalker. Mr. Cummings reined in his horse when he arrived in front of him, gave him a pleasant salutation, and invited him to a seat in the vehicle. "If you are going my way," he added. The man raised his head, looked him full in the face, but neither answered nor made any further movement. The minister, with good-natured persistence, repeated his invitation. At this, the man threw his right hand forward from his side and pointed downward as he stood on the extreme edge of the bridge. Mr. Cummings looked past him over into the ravine, saw nothing unusual, and withdrew his eyes to address the man again. He had disappeared. The horse, which all this time had been uncommonly restless, gave at the same moment a snort of terror and started to run away. Before he had regained control of the animal, the minister was at the crest of the hill, 100 yards along. He looked back and saw the figure again, at the same place and in the same attitude as when he had first observed it. Then for the first time he was conscious of a sense of supernatural, and drove home as rapidly as his willing horse would go. On arriving at home, he related his adventure to his family, and early the next morning, accompanied by two neighbors, John White Corwell and Abner Razor, returned to the spot. They found the body of Old Man Baker hanging by the neck from one of the beams of the bridge, immediately beneath the spot where the apparition had stood. A thick coating of dust, slightly dampened by the mist, covered the floor of the bridge, but the only footprints were those of Mr. Cummings' horse. In taking down the body, the men disturbed the loose, friable earth of the slope below it, disclosing human bones already nearly uncovered by the action of water and frost. They were identified as those of the lost peddler. At the double inquest, the coroner's jury found that Daniel Baker died by his own hand while suffering from temporary insanity, and that Samuel Moritz was murdered by some person or persons to the jury unknown. A Cold Greeting. This is a story told by the late Benson Foley of San Francisco. In the summer of 1881, I met a man named James H. Conway, a resident of Franklin, Tennessee. He was visiting San Francisco for his health, deluded man, and brought me a note of introduction from Mr. Lawrence Barting. I had known Barting as a captain in the Federal Army during the Civil War. At its close, he had settled in Franklin, and in time became, I had reason to think, somewhat prominent as a lawyer. Barting had always seemed to me an honorable and truthful man, and the warm friendship which he expressed in his note for Mr. Conway was to me sufficient evidence that the latter was in every way worthy of my confidence and esteem. At dinner one day, Conway told me that it had been solemnly agreed between him and Barting that the one who died first should, if possible, communicate with the other from beyond the grave in some unmistakable way. Just how they had left wisely, it seemed to me, to be decided by the deceased, according to the opportunities that his altered circumstances might present. A few weeks after the conversation in which Mr. Conway spoke of this agreement, I met him one day, walking slowly down Montgomery Street, apparently from his abstracted air, in deep thought. He greeted me coldly, with merely a movement of the head, and passed on, leaving me standing on the walk, with half-proffered hand, surprised and naturally somewhat piqued. The next day I met him again in the office of the Palace Hotel, and seeing him about to repeat the disagreeable performance of the day before, intercepted him in a doorway with a friendly salutation, and bluntly requested an explanation of his altered manner. He hesitated a moment, then, looking me frankly in the eyes, said, "I do not think, Mr. Foley, that I have any longer a claim to your friendship, since Mr. Barting appears to have withdrawn his own from me. For what reason, I protest I do not know. If he has not already informed you, he probably will do so." "But," I replied, "I have not heard from Mr. Barting." "Heard from him?" he repeated, with apparent surprise. "Why, he is here. I met him yesterday, 10 minutes before meeting you. I gave you exactly the same greeting that he gave me. I met him again not a quarter of an hour ago, and his manner was precisely the same. He merely bowed and passed on. I shall not soon forget your civility to me. Good morning, or, as it may please you, farewell. All this seemed to me singularly considerate and delicate behavior on the part of Mr. Conway. As dramatic situations and literary effects are foreign to my purpose, I will explain at once that Mr. Barting was dead. He had died in Nashville 4 days before this conversation. Calling on Mr. Conway, I appraised him of our friend's death, showing him the letters announcing it. He was visibly affected in a way that forbade me to entertain a doubt of his sincerity. "It seems incredible," he said, after a period of reflection. "I suppose I must have mistaken another man for Barting, and that man's cold greeting was merely a stranger's civil acknowledgment of my own. I remember, indeed, that he lacked Barting's moustache." "Doubtless it was another man," I assented, "and the subject was never afterward mentioned between us. But I had in my pocket a photograph of Barting, which had been enclosed in the letter from his widow. It had been taken a week before his death, and was without a moustache." A wireless message. In the summer of 1896, Mr. William Holt, a wealthy manufacturer of Chicago, was living temporarily in a little town of central New York, the name of which the writer's memory has not retained. Mr. Holt had had trouble with his wife, from whom he had parted a year before. Whether the trouble was anything more serious than incompatibility of temper, he is probably the only living person that knows. He is not addicted to the vice of confidences. Yet he has related the incident herein set down to at least one person without exacting a pledge of secrecy. He is now living in Europe. One evening, he had left the house of a brother whom he was visiting for a stroll in the country. It may be assumed, whatever the value of the assumption in connection with what is said to have occurred, that his mind was occupied with reflections on his domestic infelicities and the distressing changes that they had wrought in his life. Whatever may have been his thoughts, they so possessed him that he observed neither the lapse of time nor whither his feet were carrying him. He knew only that he had passed far beyond the town limits, and was traversing a lonely region by a road that bore no resemblance to the one by which he had left the village. In brief, he was lost. Realizing his mischance, he smiled. Central New York is not a region of perils, nor does one long remain lost in it. He turned about and went back the way that he had come. Before he had gone far, he observed that the landscape was growing more distinct, was brightening. Everything was suffused with a soft red glow, in which he saw his shadow projected in the road before him. "The moon is rising," he said to himself. Then he remembered that it was about the time of the new moon, and if that tricksy orb was in one of its stages of visibility, it had set long before. He stopped and faced about, seeking the source of the rapidly broadening light. As he did so, his shadow turned and lay along the road in front of him as before. The light still came from behind him. That was surprising. He could not understand. Again he turned, and again, facing successively to every point of the horizon. Always the shadow was before, always the light behind, a still and awful red. Holt was astonished. Dumbfounded is the word that he used in telling it, yet seems to have retained a certain intelligent curiosity. To test the intensity of the light, whose nature and cause he could not determine, he took out his watch to see if he could make out the figures on the dial. They were plainly visible, and the hands indicated the hour of 11 o'clock and 25 minutes. At that moment, the mysterious illumination suddenly flared to an intense and almost blinding splendor, flushing the entire sky, extinguishing the stars, and throwing the monstrous shadow of himself athwart the landscape. In that unearthly illumination, he saw near him, but apparently in the air at a considerable elevation, the figure of his wife, clad in her night clothing, and holding to her breast the figure of his child. Her eyes were fixed upon his with an expression which he afterward professed himself unable to name or describe. Further than that, it was not of this life. The flare was momentary, followed by black darkness, in which, however, the apparition still showed white and motionless. Then by insensible degrees it faded and vanished, like a bright image on the retina after the closing of the eyes. A peculiarity of the apparition, hardly noted at the time, but afterward recalled, was that it showed only of the upper half of the woman's figure. Nothing was seen below the waist. The sudden darkness was comparative, not absolute, for gradually all objects of this environment became again visible. In the dawning of the morning, Holt found himself entering the village at a point opposite to that at which he had left it. He soon arrived at the house of his brother, who hardly knew him. He was wild-eyed, haggard, gray as a rat. Almost incoherently, he related his night's experience. "Go to bed, my poor fellow," said his brother. "And wait. We shall hear more of this." An hour later came the predestined telegram. Holt's dwelling in one of the suburbs of Chicago had been destroyed by fire. Her escape cut off by the flames, his wife had appeared at an upper window, her child in her arms. There she stood, motionless, apparently dazed. Just as the firemen had arrived with a ladder, the floor had given way, and she was seen no more. The moment of this culminating horror was 11 o'clock and 25 minutes, standard time. A final tale, an arrest. Having murdered his brother-in-law, Orrin Brower of Kentucky was a fugitive from justice. From the county jail where he had been confined to wait his trial, he had escaped by knocking down his jailer with an iron bar, robbing him of his keys, and opening the outer door, walking out into the night. The jailer being unarmed, Brower got no weapon with which to defend his recovered liberty. As soon as he was out of the town, he had the folly to enter a forest. This was many years ago, when that region was wilder than it is now. The night was pretty dark, with neither moon nor stars visible, and as Brower had never dwelt thereabout, and knew nothing of the lay of the land, he was naturally not long in losing himself. He could not have said if he were getting farther away from the town, or going back to it, a most important matter to Orrin Brower. He knew that in either case a posse of citizens with a pack of bloodhounds would soon be on his track, and his chance of escape was very slender. But he did not wish to assist in his own pursuit. Even an added hour of freedom was worth having. Suddenly he emerged from the forest into an old road, and there before him saw indistinctly the figure of a man motionless in the gloom. It was too late to retreat. The fugitive felt that at the first movement back toward the wood he would be, as he afterward explained, filled with buckshot. So the two stood there like trees, Brower nearly suffocated by the activity of his own heart. The emotions of the other are not recorded. A moment later, it may have been an hour, the moon sailed into a patch of unclouded sky, and the hunted man saw that visible embodiment of law lift an arm and point significantly toward and beyond him. He understood. Turning his back to his captor, he walked submissively away in the direction indicated, looking to neither the right nor the left. Hardly daring to breathe, his head and back actually aching with the prophecy of buckshot. Brower was as courageous a criminal as ever lived to be hanged. That was shown by the conditions of awful personal peril in which he had coolly killed his brother-in-law. It is needless to relate them here. They came out at his trial, and the revelation of his calmness in confronting them came near to saving his neck. But what would you have? When a brave man is beaten, he submits. So they pursued their journey jailward, along the old road through the woods. Only once did Brower venture a turn of the head, just once, when he was in deep shadow, and he knew that the other was in moonlight. He looked backward. His captor was Burton Duff, the jailer, as white as death, and bearing upon his brow the livid mark of the iron bar. Orrin Brower had no further curiosity. Eventually they entered the town, which was all alight, but deserted. Only the women and children remained, and they were off the streets. Straight toward the jail the criminal held his way. Straight up to the main entrance he walked, laid his hand upon the knob of the heavy iron door, pushed it open without command, entered and found himself in the presence of 6 armed men. Then he turned. Nobody else entered. On a table in the corridor lay the dead body of Burton Duff. Homecoming by Sidney J. Bounds. He woke as though from a deep sleep, with a feeling of languor, and his first sensation was unpleasant, a smell of rotting flesh. He opened gummy eyes to a blur of faces. Mouths gaped, and speech babbled in a meaningless stream. Then he felt the sting of a hypodermic, and the fog began to clear. The blur resolved into 2 faces, both male and obviously excited. One was young, with a straggle of beard, pimply where the skin was naked. The older had fish eyes behind thick-lensed spectacles, devil's eyebrows above. Each man wore a white gown and a latex gloves. "Can you hear me?" Of course he could hear them. He wasn't deaf, but the effort needed to reply was beyond him in his present condition. He lay flat on his back, facing a dead white ceiling. The powerful glare from massed arc lamps made him blink and look away, toward a blank wall where tubes drained into a stainless steel tank. It was cold. "If you hear me, try to move your fingers." He started to raise an arm, which seemed weighted with a hand of lead. But when his hand came into focus, his arm froze. He stared at moldy flesh and sticks of protruding bone. His own hand? The sight brought him dismayingly to the here and now, and a knowledge of the source of the smell. Himself. Memory began to tickle through the cells of his brain. His name, Michael Wilde, called Mickey by his friends. He half remembered a series of business failures, used car dealer, an antique shop, second-hand books, and a girl. He couldn't recall her name now, only that he'd been crazy about her. That and the Black Depression when she'd walked out on him. It seemed moments ago when he'd filled the bath and lay back in it. He tasted again the bitterness of sleeping tablets. He was still drowsy, but the cold cut into him, made him shiver. "Yes, I can hear you," he croaked, and it felt as though his throat muscles had rusted. With creaking effort, he swung leaden legs off the tabletop and struggled to a sitting position. He was in a laboratory of some kind, with black boxes and cylinders and a panel studded with dials and switches. The two doctors looked pleased. "An unqualified success," one commented. Unqualified? He could be feeling better than this. "Surely you can do something about the smell." The young one squeezed an aerosol can, spraying perfume. It didn't kill the sickly sweet odor, but masked it to some extent. "That's a bit better." Wilde looked down at his naked body, saw bluish flesh peeling like the aftermath of some obscure disease. He swallowed. "Anyway, thanks for saving my life." "Guess you got to me barely in time. Don't worry, I won't suicide again." The young man smiled. "Oh, we didn't," he said pleasantly. "You were truly dead. Certified and in the grave for 7 days. We dug you up secretly at night, and Dr. Barnes tried out his revival technique on you. The experiment has succeeded beyond our best hopes." Really dead, then, and now resurrected. Uneasiness rumbled in his stomach, like the onset of indigestion. His mind churned gruesome thoughts. "This technique of yours." "Something quite new in medical history. The body flushed out and refilled with fresh blood, the cells stimulated by bioelectricity. The heart restarted. You've no idea the time and trouble we've spent on you." Experiment. Fresh blood. A pulse beat in Wilde's head. "Well, thanks again. I suppose you've some clothes that'll fit me. Barnes lifted devil's eyebrows.
For the time being, you'll stay here. You're alive again, and that's miracle enough, but by no means fully recovered. Brain tissue is quickly damaged when starved of oxygen.
Besides, there'd be a dreadful row if it got about we'd been robbing graves,
the young doctor added.
We'll keep you under observation for a bit. We've a lot more tests to make.
Under observation. Tests. The words jolted Michael Wilde. He never liked the idea of human guinea pigs, and didn't intend to let them continue using him. He slid from the table, stood upright, swaying. I feel fine. Nobody asked you to resurrect me.
This is a secret experiment for the advancement of medical knowledge. We can't expect the common people to understand.
Anger flared like a very light. It wasn't for my benefit, then. You don't care what happens to me.
Of course we do,
the young man said soothingly.
That's why you should stay here and let us take care of you. Full recovery may be a long process.
He picked up another aerosol, carefully sprayed Wilde's ribs. His bluish flesh sloughed off.
After all, you're our prize specimen.
It may have been the word specimen that triggered him off. Anger surged into berserk fury. The pumped strength into his muscles. He lumbered forward, uttering a hoarse cry, glaring through a red haze. He'd never liked doctors anyway. His hand grasped a wrench lying on a bench. He swiped drunkenly, connecting with Barnes' head. The doctor fell, blood spurting. The young one backed away, turned and fled. He tore open a door, bounded up steps 3 at a time. Wilde shuffled after him. At the top of the steps, he found another door leading on to the outside world. He saw open country, and the doctor streaking across it like in a Land Rover. The sun warmed him. Birdsong thrilled him. He breathed deeply of blossom-scented air before returning inside. Searching, he found clothes that fitted him rather a fashion, and a mirror. His hair, once brown and luxurious, was shedding, and he wore a bristle like hog's hair on his jaw. Pus oozed from one ear. He probed with his tongue and worked out a loose tooth. Suppressing a shudder, he turned from the mirror and climbed the steps. Outside again, he walked down a lane, not recognizing where he was. He soon found it tiring to walk, and startlingly aware of the brittleness of his bones. Lowered himself gently onto a grassy bank. While he rested, a small black and white terrier came weaving across the fields. "Good dog," he cried. "Here, boy." The dog trotted toward him and stopped, wagging its tail. Then it sniffed with its sensitive nose, and tail between its legs, bolted, howling. Wilde felt his depression return. He forced himself to rise and walked on. The landscape was bleak moorland, deserted, but the doctors would naturally pick a lonely spot for their experiment. An hour passed before he came on an isolated cottage. He limped up to the front door and knocked. An old man opened it, stared and gulped an inarticulate sound. "Good afternoon," Wilde said politely. "I wonder if—" He was slammed back against the door frame as the old roan rushed past him, running down the lane. Swearing, he entered the cottage and helped himself to bread and cold sausage from the larder. He sat at the table, eating cautiously at first, then greedily. His stomach appeared to be in working order, and he felt stronger afterward. But what did he know? What did he know? Legally dead, he was damned if he was going to perform like a rat in a maze. That was definite. He needed help. It took only a couple of minutes to be sure there was no telephone in the cottage, so he set off again. The lane wound between hedgerows, and perhaps 15 minutes later, he knew he had taken the same direction as the old man. The village was a small one, and the street cleared quickly as he approached. Shutters closed, bolts slammed home. White faces peered from upstairs windows. He walked almost out of the village before he saw a telephone box. He pulled open the door and squeezed inside, searching through pockets for a coin. He located one that had slipped through a hole in the lining and wondered who he should call. Pete? Yes, Pete would think of something, but he couldn't remember the number. He glanced back at the village. There were men on the street, gathering in a compact group, and they had dogs, shotguns, hay forks. Wilde didn't like the way the situation was developing. He shot out of the phone box, hurrying across a field, keeping close to the hedge for cover. The mob followed him. They didn't seem anxious to catch up. Perhaps they only wanted to drive him away. He was able to keep ahead of them, but they didn't give up. Still, they came after him. He crossed another field and reached the outskirts of a wood. He was tiring again, heart pounding. There might be safety among the trees, somewhere to hide until dark. He limped on and saw a teenage girl coming toward him, and desire stirred in him. For the first time since his resurrection, he felt glad to be alive. But he didn't want to scare her away. He waited behind the trunk of a tree until she came close. Then he stepped out, soft words on bloated lips. She gave a choked-off scream and collapsed at his feet. Cursing, he lifted her and stumbled into the wood, laid her down on a patch of grass. She was pretty, perhaps 17 or 18, with well-shaped legs. Tactfully, he straightened her miniskirt. Small breasts heaved convulsively under a thin sweater. His desire mounted. After a few minutes, she came to and looked up into his face. Her scream of terror pierced the sky, sending black rooks flapping. Quiet, he pleaded. Don't be scared, I need your help. It was no good. Her face off-white, she stared at the ground, body shaking with silent sobs. Wilde stood angrily over her, realizing she was going to be no help. Then he heard dogs howling. He stumbled deeper into the wood, pushing through undergrowth until he came to a small stream. He waded in, hoping to throw them off the scent. Even to him, the smell was getting so bad, he could hardly stand it. He heard men threshing the bushes behind him. It began to rain, large, warm drops. In the distance, thunder rolled. The sky darkened. Rain pelted down, soaking his clothes, turning the ground to mud. His feet dragged like heavy weights, and pieces of decayed flesh dropped from hands and face, leaving a rancid trail he hoped the rain would destroy. The sound of the chase faded as the rain increased, and depression returned, black as the sky. Resurrection hadn't done him much good so far. Perhaps he should return to the laboratory before it was too late. His heartbeat seemed to be slowing, and every step became an agony. A memory of Dr. Barnes nagged him. He veered through an arc circling. The sky was dark, the rain a wet curtain obscuring vision. He slipped in the mud, and it was too much effort to rise. So he crawled on hands and knees, wondering why he bothered. So much easier just to lie where he was. Another memory of a man dying in the Arctic. He crawled on till he felt a rough stone wall, followed it to a gate. He pushed the gate open and crawled inside, imagining a house, medical aid. Unexpectedly, he fell into a hole. It was a deep hole, and he lacked the energy to climb out. He turned over to lie on his back and look up at the sky. Felt rain on his face. Lightning flashed, revealing the tops of bone-white headstones. The soil had the smell of newly dug earth. In a way, he supposed it was kind of a homecoming, and he settled down to wait for death to catch up with him. Feeders and Eaters by Neil Gaiman. This is a true story, pretty much. As far as that goes, and whatever good it does anybody. It was late one night, and I was cold, in a city where I had no right to be. Not at that time of night, anyway. I won't tell you which city. I'd missed my last train, and I wasn't sleepy. So I prowled the streets around the station until I found an all-night cafe, somewhere warm to sit. You know the kind of place. You've been there. Cafe's name on a Pepsi sign above a dirty plate glass window. Dried egg residue between the tines of all their forks. I wasn't hungry, but I bought a slice of toast and a mug of greasy tea, so they'd leave me alone. There were a couple of other people in there, sitting alone at their tables, derelicts and insomniacs, huddled over their empty plates. Dirty coats and donkey jackets, each buttoned up to the neck. I was walking back from the counter with my tray when somebody said, "Hey." It was a man's voice. "You," the voice said to me, and I knew he was talking to me, not to the room. "I know you. Come here. Sit over here." I ignored it. You don't want to get involved, not with anyone you'd run into in a place like that. Then he said my name, and I turned and looked at him. When someone knows your name, you don't have any option.
I can already hear you starting to eat.
What? Sorry. Never mind that.
Don't you know me?
He asked. I shook my head. I didn't know anyone who looked like that. You don't forget something like that.
It's me,
he said, his voice a pleading whisper.
Eddie Barrow. Come on, mate. You know me.
And when he said his name, I did know him, more or less. I mean, I knew Eddie Barrow. He had worked on a building site together 10 years back, during my only real flirtation with manual work. Eddie Barrow was tall and heavily muscled, with a movie star smile and lazy good looks. He was ex-police. Sometimes he'd tell me stories, true tales of fitting up and doing over, of punishment and crime. He had left the force after some trouble between him and one of the top brass. He said it was the chief superintendent's wife forced him to leave. Eddie was always getting into trouble with women. They really liked him, women. When we were working together on the building site, they'd hunt him down, give him sandwiches, little presents, whatever. He never seemed to do anything to make them like him. They just liked him. I used to watch him to see how he did it, but it didn't seem to be anything he did. Eventually I decided it was just the way he was. Big, strong, not very bright, and terribly, terribly good looking. But that was 10 years ago. The man sitting at the Formica table wasn't good looking. His eyes were dull, rimmed with red, and they stared down at the tabletop without hope. His skin was grey. He was too thin, obscenely thin. I could see his scalp through his filthy hair. I said, "What happened to you?"
How do you mean?
"Well, you look a bit rough," I said, although he looked worse than rough. He looked dead. Eddie Barrow had been a big guy. Now he'd collapsed in on himself. All bones and flaking skin.
Yeah,
he said. Or maybe,
yeah.
I couldn't tell. Then resigned flatly.
Happens to us all in the end.
He gestured with his left hand, pointed at the seat opposite him. His right arm hung stiffly at his side, his right hand safe and hidden in the pocket of his coat. Eddie's table was by the window, where anyone walking past could see you. Not somewhere I'd sit by choice, not if it was up to me. But it was too late now. I sat down facing him and I sipped my tea. I didn't say anything, which could have been a mistake. Small talk might have kept his demons at a distance, but I cradled my mug and I said nothing. So I suppose he must have thought that I wanted to know more, that I cared. I didn't care. I had enough problems of my own. I didn't want to know about his struggle, whatever it was that he had, whatever brought him to this state, drink or drugs or disease. But he started to talk in a grey voice, and I listened.
I came here a few years back, when they were building the bypass. Stuck around after the way you do. Got a room in an old place around the back, Prince Regent Street. Room in the attic. It was a family house, really. They only rented out the top floor. So there were just the two boarders, me and Miss Corvier. We were both up in the attic, but in separate rooms, next door to each other. I'd hear them moving about, and there was a cat. It was the family cat, but it came upstairs to say hello every now and again, which is more than the family ever did. I always had my meals with the family, but Miss Corvia, she didn't ever come down for the meals. So it was a week before I met her. She was coming out of the upstairs lavvy. She looked so old. Wrinkled face, like an old monkey. But long hair, down to her waist, like a young girl. That's funny, with older people, you don't think they feel things like you do. I mean, here's her, old enough to be my granny. And he stopped, licked his lips with a grey tongue. Anyway, I came up to the room one night, and there's a brown paper bag of mushrooms outside of my door on the ground. It was a present. I knew that straight off. A present for me. Not normal mushrooms, though. So I knocked on the door. I says, "Are these for me?" "Packed them myself, Mr. Burrows," she says. "Oh, they aren't like toadstools or anything," I asked. "You're not poisonous or funny mushrooms." She just laughs, cackles even. "They're for eating," she says. "Oh, they're fine. Shaggy ink caps they are. Eat them soon now, and they go off quick. They're best fried up in a little butter and garlic." I say, "Are you having some too?" She says, "No," she says. I used to be a proper one for mushrooms, but not anymore. Not with my stomach. But they're lovely. Nothing better than a young shaggy ink-cap mushroom. It's astonishing the things that people don't eat. Or the things around them that people could eat, if only they knew it. I said thanks, and I went back into my half of the attic. They'd done the conversion a few years before. Nice job, really. I put the mushrooms down by the sink. After a few days, they dissolved into black stuff like ink, and I had to put the whole mess into a plastic bag, throw it away. I'm on my way downstairs with a plastic bag, and I run into her on the stairs. She says, "Hello, Mr. B." I say, "Hello, Miss Corvier." "Call me Effie," she says. "How were the mushrooms?" "Very nice, thank you," I said. "They were lovely." She'd leave me other things. After that, little presents. Flowers and old milk bottles. Things like that. Then nothing. I was a bit relieved when the presents suddenly stopped. So I'm down at dinner with the family. The lad at the pulley. He was home for the holidays. It was August, really hot. And someone says, "I haven't seen her for about a week. I'm gonna look in on her." I said I didn't mind. So I did. The door wasn't locked. She was in bed. She had a thin sheet over her, but you could see that she was naked on her sheet. Not that I was trying to see anything. It'd be like looking at your gran and the altogether. This old lady, but she looked so pleased to see me. "Do you need a doctor?" I says. She shakes her head. "I'm not ill," she says. "I'm hungry, that's all." "Are you sure?" I say. "'Cause I can call someone. It's not a bother. They come out for old people." She says, "Edward, I don't want to be a burden on anyone, but I'm so hungry." "Right. I'll get you something to eat," I said. "Something easy on your tummy," I said. That's when she surprises me. She looks embarrassed. Then she says, very quietly, "Meat. It's got to be fresh meat.
and raw. I won't let anyone else cook for me. Meat, please, Edward. Oh, not a problem, I says. I'll go downstairs. I thought for a moment about nicking it from the cat's bowl, but of course didn't. It was like, I know she wanted it, so I had to do it. I had no choice. I went down to Safeway, and I bought her a ready pack of best ground sirloin. The cat smelled it, followed me up the stairs. I said, "You get down, puss. It's not for you. It's for Miss Curvey. She's not feeling well. She's going to need it for her supper." Oh, the thing mewed at me, as if it hadn't been fed in a week, which I knew wasn't true because its bowl was still half full. Stupid like I was. I knocked on her door. She says, "Come in." She's still in the bed. And I gave her a pack of meat. She says, "Thank you, Edward. You've got a good heart." She starts to tear off the plastic wrap there in the bed. There's a puddle of brown blood under the plastic tray, and it drips under her sheet, but she don't notice. Makes me shiver. I'm going out the door, and I can already hear her starting to eat with her fingers, cramming the roll mince into her mouth. She hadn't got out of bed. Did I say mouth? But the next day, she's up and about, and from there on, she's in and out all hours, in spite of her age. And I think there you are. They say red meat's bad for you, but it did a world of good for her. And raw, well, it's just steak tartare, innit? You ever eaten raw meat? The question came to me as a surprise. I said, "Me?" Eddie looked at me with his dead eyes, and he said, "Nobody else at this table?" "Ah, yes, a little. When I was a small boy, 4 or 5 years old, my grandmother would take me to the butcher's with her, and he'd give me slices of raw liver, and I'd just eat them, there in the shop like that, and everyone would laugh. I hadn't thought of that in 20 years, but it was true. I still like my liver rare, and sometimes, if I'm cooking and if no one else is around, I'll cut a thin slice of raw liver before I season it, and I'll eat it, relishing the texture and the naked iron taste. No, me. I like my meat properly cooked." So the next thing that happened was Thompson. Thompson went missing. Thompson? The cat. Somebody said there used to be 2 of them, and they called them Thompson and Thompson. I don't know why. Stupid, giving them both the same name. The first one was squashed by a lorry. He pushed at a small mound of sugar on the formica top with a fingertip. His left hand still... Sorry, I'm getting up. Where am I? His left hand still. I was beginning to wonder whether he had a right arm. Maybe the sleeve was empty. Not that it was any of my business. Nobody gets through life without losing a few things on the way. I was trying to think of some way of telling him that I didn't have any money, just in case he was going to ask me for something when he got to the end of his story. I didn't have any money. Just a train ticket and enough pennies for the bus ticket home. I was never much of one for cats. Not really. I like dogs. Big faithful things. You knew where you were with a dog. No cats. Go for days on end, you don't see him. When I was a lad, we had a cat. It was called Ginger. There was a family down the street, and they had a cat called Marmalade. Turned out it was the same cat getting fed by all of us. Well, I mean, sneaky little buggers. You can't trust them. That's why I didn't think anything when Thompson went away. The family was worried, not me. I knew he'd come back, they always do. Anyway, a few nights later, I heard it. I was trying to sleep and I couldn't. It was the middle of the night. I heard this mewing going on and on and on. It wasn't loud. But when you couldn't sleep, these things, they just get on your nerves. I thought maybe it was stuck up in the rafters, out on the roof outside. Whatever it was, there wasn't a point in trying to sleep through it. I knew that. So I got up and I got dressed. Even put on my boots on in case I was going to be climbing up on the roof. And I went looking for the cat. I went out in the corridor. He was coming from Mrs. Corriver's room. On the other side of the attic. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I tried the door. It wasn't locked, so I went in. I thought maybe the cat was stuck somewhere or hurt. I didn't know. I just wanted to help, really. Miss Corriver wasn't there. I mean, sometimes if there's anyone in a room and that room was empty. Except there's something on the floor in the corner going, Marie, Marie, Marie. I turned on the light to see what it was.
He stopped then for almost a minute, the fingers of his left hand picking at the black goo that had crusted around the neck of the ketchup bottle. It was shaped like a large tomato. Then he said,
What I didn't understand was how I could still be alive. I mean, it was. And from the chest up, it was alive and breathing. And fire and everything. But its back legs and its rib cage, like a chicken carcass. Just bones. And what are they called? Sinews. And it lifted its head and it looked at me. It may have been a cat, but I knew what it wanted. It was in its eyes, Well, I just knew. I've never seen eyes like that. You would have known what it wanted, all it wanted, if you'd seen those eyes. I did what it wanted. You'd have to be a monster not to.
What did you do?
I used my boots. There wasn't much blood. Not really. I just stamped on his head. Though there wasn't really anything much left that looked like anything. If you'd seen it looking at you like that, you would have done what I did.
I didn't say anything.
And then I heard someone coming up the stairs to the attic. I thought I ought to do something. It didn't look good. I didn't even know what it must have looked like, really, but I just stood there feeling stupid with a stinking mess in my boots. When the door opens, it's Miss Corriver. And she sees it all. She looks at me and she says, You killed him? I can hear something funny in her voice. For a moment, I don't know what it is. And then she comes closer. And I realise that she's crying. Oh, that's something about old people when they cry like children. You don't know where to look. And she says,
It was all I had to keep me going, and you killed him. After all I've done.
And she says,
Baking it so the meat stays fresh, so the life stays on. After all I've done. I'm an old woman, she says. I need my meat.
I didn't know what to say. She's wiping her eyes with her hand.
I don't want to be a burden on anybody,
she says. She's crying now. And she's looking at me. And she says,
I never wanted to be a burden. That was my meat. Now, who's going to feed me now? He stopped, resting his grey face on his left hand, as if he was tired. Tired of talking to me. Tired of the story. Tired of life. Then he shook his hand. Or he shook his head, sorry. He shook his head and he looked at me. And he said,
If you'd seen that cat, you would have done what I did. Anyone would have done.
He raised his head then, for the first time in his story, looked me in the eyes. I thought I saw an appeal for him, for help in his eyes, something he was too proud to say aloud. Here it comes, I thought. This is where he asked me for money. Somebody outside tapped on the window of the cafe. It wasn't a loud tapping, but Eddie jumped. He said,
"I have to go now. That means I have to go."
I just nodded. He got up from the table. He was still a tall man, which almost surprised me. He collapsed in on himself in so many other ways. He pushed the table away as he got up, and as he got up he took his right hand out of his coat pocket, for balance, I suppose, I don't know. Maybe he wanted me to see it. But if he wanted me to see it, why did he keep it in his pocket the whole time? No, I don't think he wanted me to see it. I think it was an accident. He wasn't wearing a shirt or a jumper under his coat, so I could see his arm and his wrist. Nothing wrong with either of them. He had a normal wrist. It was only when you looked below the wrist that you saw most of the flesh had been picked away from the bones, chewed like chicken wings, leaving only dried morsels of meat, scraps and crumbs, and little else. He only had 3 fingers left, and most of a thumb. I suppose the other finger bones must have fallen right off, with no skin or flesh to hold them on. That was what I saw, only for a moment, when he put his hand back in his pocket and pushed out of the door into the chilly night. I watched him then through the dirty plate glass of the cafe window. It was funny. From everything he'd said, I'd imagined Miss Corvier to be an old woman, but the woman waiting for him outside on the pavement couldn't have been much over 30. She had long hair, though. The kind of hair you can sit on, as they say, although that always sounds faintly like a line from a dirty joke. She looked a bit like a hippie, I suppose, sort of pretty in a hungry kind of way. She took his arm and looked up into his eyes, and they walked out of the cafe's light for all the world like a couple of teenagers who were just beginning to realize that they were in love. I went back up to the counter and bought another cup of tea and a couple of packets of crisps to see me through until the morning. And I sat and thought about the expression on his face when he looked at me that last time. On the milk train back to the big city, I sat opposite a woman carrying a baby. He was floating in formaldehyde in a heavy glass container. She needed to sell it rather urgently, and although I was extremely tired, we talked about her reasons for selling it, and about other things, for the rest of the journey.
The 2 Americans surfaced slowly, dizzy from the sights of the Great Barrier Reef. Excuse me. I needed a drink. I don't want me coughing into the microphone. The 2 Americans surfaced slowly, dizzy from the sights of the Great Barrier Reef. The endless, billowing vistas of coral, the lone, shy, deadly, blue-ringed octopus, the crown of thorns starfish that was beautiful, even as it gradually nibbled away the reef. The boat was nowhere in sight. They removed their mouthpieces, cleared their face masks of water, and looked again. The boat was still gone. "I think they've left us," said Theo. Don't be stupid," said Jack. They had arrived in Australia a week and a half ago, starting out in gay-friendly Sydney to acclimatise themselves and avoid hearing, at least for a few days, the age-old but tiresome question, "Are you two together?" Neither of them wanted to answer that, not about each other, not anymore. Both were in their late 30s. Theo, a pastry chef, was brought across the shoulders, handsome in the manner of an ageing schoolboy, conciliatory unless his patience was stretched too far. Jack, a freelance writer for magazines, was long and lean, hatchet-faced and red-headed, always ready with a side-of-the-mouth barb to stretch Theo's patience. They had spent 12 years together in each other's company. The first 8 or so had been good. The trip was an attempt to recapture that goodness. In his heart, neither believed it would work, but the idea of having again what they'd once had, what they'd once taken for granted, was worth the time, money, and the chance. It was impossible to put one's finger on the moment when things had begun to sour between them. They'd never been one of those couples who got along perfectly, or seemed to. Even during the first couple of years, their fights were frequent, loud, and passionate. Sometimes they reconciled with furious lovemaking. More often, they would wake up the next morning and find that the whole thing had just seemed silly. They were friends as well as lovers then. Friends could fight, air it out, and then put it behind them. Friends could laugh at such things. They had spent such time laughing together. It was when they stopped fighting that things had begun to atrophy. Now, instead of fighting, they sniped constantly. A shortcoming pointed out here, an old grievance dredged up there. It was a habit that clung as closely to them as they had once clung to each other. Friends did not snipe, but Jack and Theo were no longer friends. The Sydney harbour threw off azure sparkles. The famous silhouette of the Opera House rose above the water like the tail flukes of a white whale diving deep. Jack and Theo chose an outdoor table at a cafe that promised harbour-caught seafood. "It's too windy out there," Jack said after a few minutes, weighing down his flapping paper napkin with his knife. "Feels good. Smells like the ocean." "Fine." Jack pulled his windbreaker tightly around his lanky frame and huddled into himself. "Let's go inside," Theo said after a few minutes. "No, it's fine. You wanted to stay out here." "You're cold. You're making that quite obvious. We won't be able to enjoy our lunch. Come on, let's go in." "Don't worry about it." Theo rose from the table, grabbing his napkin and silverware. "I said let's go into the fucking restaurant." He turned and stalked through the double doors of the cafe, not turning to see if Jack followed. After a minute, Jack did. The combination platter of prawns, oysters, and Balmain bugs was fresh and delicious. 10 minutes after it was served, Theo started checking his watch. "What's wrong?" Jack asked. "The food took so long to come. If we don't get going soon, we're going to miss the 1:15 ferry over to the zoo." "So, we'll catch the next one." "I wanted to get there by 2 o'clock. "What difference does it make?" "It's a big zoo. We won't have time to see it all if we don't get there early enough." "So we'll see whatever we have time for."
What's the point of that? If we're not going to see it at all, we may as well not go. In fact, let's just not go. Oh, come on. Where else are we going to see a live platypus? This was Jack's feeble attempt at a joke. His once irrepressible wit still occasionally tossed one out, but Theo never laughed anymore. Oh, we can see one on the Nature Channel back home.
Well, is that good enough for you? See something on TV? Figures.
In so it went, over the cracked and sliced bodies of the small sea creatures. As it turned out, they did take the ferry to the Taronga Park Zoo that day and even saw a live platypus. But neither of them enjoyed it very much. 2 years ago, Jack had discovered that Theo was sleeping with a line cook at the restaurant where they worked. Where he worked. Theo had always maintained that he was bisexual, at least in theory. But the fact that the line cook was a woman made Jack feel doubly betrayed. It was as if Theo was rejected, he had rejected not just him, but his very maleness. The affair was not serious, and Theo had already broken it off by the time Jack found out. The line cook no longer worked at Theo's restaurant, and Theo swore he didn't know or care where she'd gone. They decided to stay together, not so much because they believed they had anything worth saving, as because the idea of being alone after so many years frightened them both too much. It is said that such betrayals may be forgiven, but can never be forgotten. Jack could do neither. Despite how the memory tore at him, or perhaps because of that tearing, he was never able to let it go. For longer than he cared to remember, he pictured Theo with a woman and felt disgusted with his own body. Could not bear to look at himself in the mirror or let Theo see him unclothed, let alone touch him. Even now, 24 months later, he would hurl it at Theo. He'd hurl it at Theo when Theo was least expecting it, in the most irrelevant situations possible, in the ugliest terms possible.
Oh, I'm not good enough for you because I don't have a pussy. Or tits, maybe, is that it?
Surrender no weapon, even if it is as likely to blow up in your face as it is to hurt your enemy. Even if you realise it is impossible for the battle ever to be won. The afternoon light on the ocean's surface was a punishing thing, glittering coldly like diamonds, reflecting back up into their eyes. Within a couple of hours, their faces were painfully sunburned. Small waves lapped against them, momentarily soothing, but eventually turning their skin chapped and salty. "The boat'll come for us," said Theo. "They'll get back to Cairns and see they forgot us. They'll shit themselves. They'll be back."
But will we still be here?
Theo realised it was a good question. They had no way of knowing how far they'd drifted from the site of the dive. They'd inflated their BCDs and lashed together their empty air tanks, creating an unwieldy flotation device to which they could cling. They linked hands across the device, helping to hold each other up. "They'll come for us," Theo said again, with less conviction. More time passed. They could not tell how much. They were very thirsty. They had stopped talking at all. The sun sank lower in the sky, and the water took on a bloody tinge. Suddenly Jack lifted his head. "Listen," he said, and then they both heard it. The sound of rotors chopping air. A helicopter. They could see it in the distance, a chitinous speck in the gloaming.
They both began to shout. Jack let go of the air tanks and struggled in the water, trying to remove his swim trunks. When he had them off, he waved them above his head, a red flag that seemed hopelessly small in the vastness. The helicopter passed far to the right, circled a time or two more, and then headed their way. Or no, sorry, didn't mean to give you false hope. It circled a time or two more, then headed away. They screamed at it until their throats were raw, even though they knew the people inside could not possibly hear them over the rotors and the wind. Theo laid his head against the air tanks and began to cry. Jack looked at him, then looked away toward where the helicopter had disappeared. "We could try to swim back," he said. Theo choked on a sob, tried to catch his breath. His nose was running, and he ducked his face into the water to clear it. "Hell, we could. Were you listening to the captain? He said the reef was 50 kilometers from Cairns." "Oh, we may have drifted closer." "Not that much closer. Not possible. And we wouldn't even know which direction to swim." "Oh, we'd go the way the chopper went." "Which way was that?" Jack looked around, started to speak, shook his head. He raised his arm out of the water to point, hesitated, and then put it down. "I don't know either," said Theo, gripping Jack's hands more tightly. They managed to heave themselves high enough on the air tanks to lay their heads together, and each felt a tiny bit of comfort, a spark in the cold salt void. It's not the end. It's a break, but it ain't the end. They'd taken a rental car in Sydney and begun the long drive north along the coastal highway, heading for Cairns, the jumping off point for dive tours of the Great Barrier Reef. Their love of scuba diving was one of the first things they discovered they had in common, a thing they had travelled all over the world to enjoy together. They shared a sense of awe for the depths, an appreciation of the sea's majesty that neither of them had ever encountered in anyone else. It seemed an eternity since their last diving trip off the western coast of Jamaica. But they knew the reef was supposed to be one of the most spectacular dives on Earth. It was a big part of what had brought them to Australia. Driving all the way to the Cairns had been Theo's idea. He'd wanted to detour into the outback along the way, but Jack had vetoed the idea on the grounds that it would be full of choking dust, black flies, and poof to eating rednecks. They made good time the first day, driving about 10 hours, then found a room in a small hotel in Brisbane. They had thought to push on the following day, but in the morning's light, Brisbane proved to be a lovely city, dotted with fountains and sculptures and even a windmill, frosted here and there with lacy ironwork balconies that reminded them of New Orleans' French Quarter. They had last been in New Orleans 9 years ago, so the memories were good. They booked their hotel room for another 2 nights. The next day they climbed Mount Coot, an easy 2-hour hike through slender trees with sunlight slanting through their branches. At the summit, Brisbane spread before them like an exquisite miniature painting, and I could see the rocky humps of islands in the bay. They lingered on the summit and found themselves alone. Jack came up behind Theo, embraced him, whispered in his ear, "I do love you. You know that. You must know that." Sorry I've been so awful the past few days. I could never have come here with anyone else.
Me either, said Theo. Squeezed Jack's long fingers tightly in his own. Let's just forget the past few days and enjoy the rest of the trip. They were too tired from the hike to have sex that night, or perhaps they were just afraid of risking the fragile peace they'd forged. But they talked for hours over dinner and wine, the kind of amiable, inconsequential talk they hadn't had in recent memory, and they slept curled tightly in each other's arms. The car wouldn't start the next morning, though, and they had to wait 4 hours for a man from the rental agency to show up with a replacement, and they began to snarl at each other again. By the time they had transferred their luggage to the new car and were heading back up the coastal highway, a heavy silence hung between them. The greatest pain was this. Each remembered the magic of the previous day on the mountain and the words they had spoken, but none of it had mattered. The owner of Sea Pearl Diving Tours had been dressing down his instructor for nearly an hour, but this did not change the fact that the instructor had somehow failed to do a head count after the last dive. Only when the boat got back to Cairns did anyone realise that 2 of the passengers were missing. Do you realise the odds of finding those people at this point? Yes, the instructor said miserably. Do you realise that it would be directly responsible for the deaths if they weren't found? Yes. Do you have any idea how much their families will be able to sue us for? You know how fucking litigious Americans are. The instructor did not answer this last question, as he had no idea how such things worked. He was just a diver who was barely good enough to teach other people the rudiments of scuba diving. But he tried to take care of his groups. The worst thing that ever happened on one of his dives prior to this was a German woman who had been badly stung by a box jellyfish. She'd been in a lot of pain and mad as hell, but ultimately she had been fine. He doubted the 2 Americans were going to be fine. Will they be searched for? Yes, you fucking wanker. They're being searched for. We've got a helicopter and 3 boats coming the 100-kilometre area of sea. A bit like finding the proverbial needle in the haystack, wouldn't you say? The instructor wouldn't say anything at all. He only just managed to stand up and get himself out of the owner's office before the hot tears of his shame began to flow. North of Brisbane, Theo and Jack crossed into the Tropic of Capricorn. The land became brown and scorched looking, and they had to turn on the rental car's air conditioner, which first worked abominably, but not at all, and then not at all. The tightening fist of the heat did nothing to improve the tempers. The scenery grew monotonous, jagged, volcanic outcroppings stabbing into a dull, reddish sky. Closer to Cairns, there would be dripping, steaming rainforest, but here there was nothing for the ride to rest upon. They made their next overnight stop at Mackay, the heart of the sugarcane belt, that began north of Brisbane and ran all the way up the coast past Cairns. Something about the cane intrigued Jack, and he wanted to explore the town. Theo, who had driven all day, had a pounding headache. In the hotel, he pulled the curtains and went to bed while it was still light. Jack ventured out alone. He walked through the straight streets along the windy riverfront, past an incongruously large shopping mall and a sign notifying that he was leaving the Mackay town limits. Then he was in the sugarcane fields. Cane towered above his head, dark purple, thick-jointed leafy. The sky was beginning to darken. In the distance he saw a column of smoke rising over the fields, then orange flames flickering through the cane. Somebody was burning off a field before harvest. Jack had read of this practice. He had read of this. So it's getting to be, isn't it? It's getting to be. Alright, a couple more pages. We've got a break. We can do it. He'd read of this practice, which removed the leaves and was said to sweeten the cane. But he had not hoped for the extraordinary good luck of actually seeing it done. He had not even known it was the right time of year. He stood at the edge of the road, watching the fire for a long time. Its fierce colour and wild motion drained the sluggishness of the long car ride ahead from him. Oh, bloody hell. I'm sorry, mates. He did not wish Theo was with him. He felt unusually free, unusually himself. Out here, away from his lover of a dozen years, he was only Jack. He was no longer the bickering, blaming Jack of Jack and Theo, though he knew he would be that Jack again tomorrow. He realised he hardly knew this Jack anymore, this man standing alone on a country road on the other side of the world from his home, watching sugarcane burn. For the thousandth, the millionth time, he thought of leaving, of walking on through the cane fields to the next town, catching a train or a bus back to Sydney. His wallet and his passport were in his pocket. He could go. He thought about this for a while, then he remembered Theo's headache. The pain in Theo's eyes had been genuine and slightly desperate. He could not bear the idea of leaving Theo to fall asleep in pain and wake up alone. Perhaps that was only his last... Bloody fucking hell. Perhaps that was only his latest excuse. But it was true. Jack turned away from the bright flames and retracted his steps back through the cane fields, back into the town, back to the hotel where Theo slept. Oh bloody. Alright, not so much more. Alright. Let's take a sip. Reflect on what we've heard. 12 bloody years. Somehow clinging to each other across the lashed together air tanks, Jack and Theo dozed fitfully through the night. They were cold when they woke at dawn, but the terrible thirst had eased a little. They both knew that it would return in the full light of day. As the sun rose in the wrong direction across the sky, they saw a plane circling low above the ocean surface far away. A little later, they saw a boat on the horizon. They shouted and waved, just as they had done the day before, but none of it made any difference. "I'm tired," said Theo. There was a crack in his voice, and at another time Jack might have latched onto that and shaken it like a pit bull. Instead he only said, "I know." "Do you think we have any chance at all?" Jack began to answer. Then his head jerked up and his eyes widened. He stared at Theo mute, obviously terrified. "What?" "I felt something brush my leg." They looked down through the clear water, saw huge dark torpedo shapes circling lazily below. "Sharks!" The dive instructor said they wouldn't bother people. Yeah, I put a lot of stock in what the dive instructor said. They were quiet for a while, staring down at the dark, circling shapes. The sharks made no attempt to approach them. Not yet. But the psychological effect
was that of a man lost in a desert who sees the first vultures overhead.
We're going to die,
said Theo. It was not a question, not even a half-veiled plea for denial or comfort. It's nothing but a statement of fact. Come here, said Jack, and let go of the air tanks. They shucked their inflatable life vests and gave them to the current. Theo kicked off his fins and his sweep trunks. They pressed their bodies together, making a line of warmth in the slight chill of the ocean. The water was a great buoyant hand, cradling them as they held each other. They sometimes still had sex, but it had been years since they'd really kissed. They kissed now, softly, remembering the feel and taste of each other's mouths. Then harder, with teeth and tongues, with fingers tangling in each other's wet hair.
You've got a one-track mind,
said Theo, and they both laughed. It was something he had said to Jack in the early, sex-drenched days of their relationship, when they could not get enough of each other. Their hands crept lower beneath the waterline. Their cocks were two rigid columns of flesh. They no longer felt the cold water, had no awareness of the depths yawning beneath them. It was like being in bed together years ago, knowing the feeling nothing outside their world of two made one. They did not trust death to give them that fabled final orgasm. They gave it to each other with their hands in the friction of their bodies. And their seed mingled with the ocean, the salty essence of their lives, returning to its primordial home. A triumph over the void as well as an acceptance of it. Then they held each other very tightly and let their tanks float away. They did not want to be taken, to wonder who would go first, to see each other ripped apart, the pool of blood spreading like an oil slick on the water's surface. Instead, they took one last breath in unison, savouring the seldom noticed sweetness of air, and dived together forever. And as your reader and a gay man, I say bull fucking shit. Have a good night.